gestalt of halachic policy, and really, it's going to be looking at issues in policy. And the fact is that the focus for many people in terms of Yiddishkeit is very micro-oriented. We think in terms of details, and therefore our focus is many ways on halacha and right down to the details. And in addition to that, we also focus in our learning on details. Like you learn a pasuk. How many times do we just sit back and say, what's the whole thing saying to us? What's the whole sugya saying to us, and so forth? And that's very much our focus is very much on micro perspectives, and the very specifics of halacha. Fact is that we really do have a broader perspective that really enunciates a policy behind our law. And a lot of times people don't like to go there because we like to say, ain't darshan time in the crowd. We don't like to give reasons for Torah. We don't like to do this. Just follow the law. The fact is that in many ways we do search for the underlying policy consideration to try and figure out what's the big picture. And that's really what I want to talk about, because I want to point out a lot of or some of the considerations in arriving at a policy decision, because in certain ways it's not so simple. It's not just so simple you put together the various mitzvot. Like, say, for example, a simple understanding of policy is vasita yasher v'atov. You shall do what is straight and good. Okay, so the Ramban says over there on the pasuk, vasita yasher v'atov. The Torah can't give you the details of in every possible case that you have to make an ethical decision. Therefore, the Torah gives you a bunch of examples, and from those examples, you're supposed to come up with a general understanding of the value, which you're supposed to apply in new situations. So that seems to say, okay, I put together the 7 different or 10 different cases. I come up with an idea of what Yasher and Tov are, and now apply it. So that's a simple policy perspective. But not every policy decision is so simple. And I'm going to give you an example, starting point. A machlokas in the Mishnah in Makos on Zayin Amud Aleph. So machlokas like this. Rabbi Tarfon v'Rabbi Akiva omrim, ilu haynu b'Sanhedrin lo nerag adam me'olam. Okay, now Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva were already, they never sat on a capital punishment case. Okay, capital punishment, we'll see, ended, they stopped dealing with capital punishment cases 40 years before the Churban. So in 30 CE, there were no more capital cases in the Jewish world. Rabbi Akiva obviously lived after that. He was in Bar Kochba Rebellion, which was 140 CE. So, and Rabbi Tarfon was his Rebbe. But the fact is that you can assume that they never dealt with capital punishment. But they said that if they ever were on the Sanhedrin that had to deal with capital punishment, they would never execute anyone. Okay? Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Amar, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who was a Nasi, says, that if you did this, Marbin Shofchei Damim B'Yisrael, you increase the murders in the Jewish people. Okay, in other words, if you did this, it would have negative consequences in terms of increasing crime, increasing capital crimes. Obviously, Shimon Gamliel felt that he was in favor of capital punishment. He said capital punishment did serve as somewhat of a deterrent, even though it was rarely used. This is the same Mishnah that says that if a Beis Din ever killed once in 7 years or once in 70 years, it would be a hanging Beis Din. So it was very rare, but still, the idea that there was capital punishment, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is saying that is a deterrent. So if you would have followed through on this plan of never executing anyone, you would have increased the murders of the Jewish people. Now, the real question is what is Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva saying? What does it mean they'll never execute anyone? The Torah says to execute, right? Most you must. There's many mitzvahs that says there's capital punishment. So what does it mean? They don't have the option to say there's no capital punishment. And Chas v'Shalom, Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva would not say it. But they knew enough, and this Gemara actually goes on to, is that the process of investigating witnesses were such that if you really wanted to discredit a witness, you could accomplish that. Okay, you can basically ask enough questions and tear into it enough that you can finally end up with a problem in the testimony. So Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva are basically saying we would apply such procedural methodology in our court, or in the court that I'm in, that it would never result in a capital punishment. There always will be a way out. Okay. And the Gemara goes into this. For example, the Gemara gives two examples. It says, what would they do in a murder case? So it says that in a murder case, they said, did you check to make sure that the animal, that the human being was a shalim and not a treifa? Because there's questions of whether if you kill a treifa, which the person is not going to live anyways, whether you get the death penalty. Okay. So the point is, he says he checks that out, and they said, did you check it out? Did you check out the place where you stuck in the knife? Because maybe where you stuck in the knife, right, you hit something that would have shown the person to be a treifa. It goes right to the details. In an Arias case, he says, what did you actually see? So it says, in general, you just have to see the two people looking like they're having relations in an Arias situation. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva says, no, you actually have to see the act. That's almost impossible. So basically, he finds ways to result in never having an execution. So halacha, he'd find ways. But the truth is the Rambam counts each one of the obligations to execute as a mitzvah on Bezdin. The Rambam counts everyone. Skila streifa, we call skila streifa cherev v'chenik, right? Stoning, burning, by the sword, beheading, or strangulation. He holds that each one there's a mitzvah on Bezdin to execute. Okay, and the Ramban says, even though the Ramban disagrees with the Rambam that it's 4 separate mitzvot, he says that there's one mitzvah on Bezdin to execute. So, what's Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva saying? You have a mitzvah. You have a mitzvah to execute. How could you try to avoid the mitzvah? Okay, so if we're questioning whether they would not be following the mitzvah is on Bezdin. Once they find to a conviction, they have to execute. So it's like an idea that if they say never got to a point of conviction, they wouldn't be over the essay. Because I never had the essay, because the essay is, once he's convicted, to follow through an execution. But he was never convicted. Okay. But still, if there's a mitzvah to execute, and you're doing it, aren't they still trying to avoid the mitzvah? Aren't they? It's like saying, I'll never wear arbor confos, so I never have to wear tzitzis. It's a way of avoiding the mitzvah. So, would they actually say, hey, we're going to try and avoid a mitzvah? And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel doesn't challenge them on the mitzvah. He doesn't sit there and say to them that it's not right what you're doing. That Kodesh Baruch Hu wants us to execute people who are deserving the death penalty. This is the idea of Torah. He says if you did what you wanted to do, it would have had negative results. But they must have had a reason for doing it. Okay, and the question is, what really was their reason? The way I understood it is that they didn't like the idea that they would be responsible for making a decision about someone's being. Right? Really, there's only one shayfet. That's a Kodesh Baruch Hu, to really understand that you're making a decision to take away someone's life. That's a heavy onus. But the fact is that clearly what they seem to be saying, there's something that seems to come across in the Torah. Anyone who reads the Torah will tell you the Torah is in favor of capital punishment, and there's an obvious reason for capital punishment, and it's a good thing, and so forth and so forth. And they're sitting there and saying, I know the Torah says that. I know the Torah talks capital punishment. I would never follow through with it. Okay? So, what do they do with the Torah? What do they do with this idea? And again, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel does not challenge them on the hashkafa. He's challenging them that it would not work. You would have other negative consequences. So it really shows you this aspect of what policy is about. And that policy is not just simply putting together mitzvot and saying, here's a mitzvah, there's a mitzvah, put it together and come to this idea. There's actually ways of how we deal with mitzvot. Certain mitzvot, we'd say, hey, this is a good mitzvah, we're going to try and make sure it always happens. Another mitzvah, we could say, yeah, that's the mitzvah, we're going to try and circumvent it. Right? Like an aguna. Yeah, that's a halacha. We're going to try and figure out ways to circumvent the halacha. Okay? Or around the halacha. There's other times where you sit there and say, no, that's what you should want to do. And then there's situations where some cases you do it, some cases you don't do it. And what comes out of all this is that there's another relationship with the halacha because of the nature of the halacha. Halacha is not just, fundamentalist statements. Part of halacha is the very idea that there are mechanics in halacha that you're supposed to work out methodologies to try and find certain heterim or certain ways of doing things a certain way. That's built into the system. So the system seems to say certain things in a broad sense, the statements Torah Shebechtav, but when it gets into Torah Shebal Peh and the analysis of halacha actually can tear into it. So, like for example, in mamzerim, there's a clear-cut idea in mamzeris. Torah talks about a mamzeris. This is what happens in a situation, the person's a mamzer. Yet you're supposed to do whatever you can in halacha to try and be matar a mamzer. Try and define him not to be a mamzer. And this is a challenge that exists. It exists also in terms of details of halacha. Certain people say, hey, it just doesn't look kosher, it doesn't sound kosher, like this is a general idea. And other people say, well, the technical movements of kashrut say this is permitted, therefore it's permitted, but it doesn't sound right. Well, that's the way halacha works, and a lot of this has to do with, and then you take it from there. Well, sometimes we say, well, technically you can get out of it, but still you should do it. And other people say, no, if you can get out of it, you shouldn't do it. So this is the challenge of policy. So policy is not just the Ramban's perception of Hasita Yashva Tov. Policy actually says how you put together the various different details of the mitzvot is actually colored by the policy that you're applying. Okay, it's like what I said when I used the term connecting the dots. The dots aren't so simple laid out there. You just sort of put a little circle around them. You have an idea. Well, then connecting the dots, you do 1, over here is 2, back forward, over there is 3, and then you go to 4. It has to create its own picture, which is not so simple to determine, and especially in halacha, where do you put it together? So, and this has come up so many times. In almost all the issues that are in the world today, the machlokas in the world today, women's issues. A lot of the questions how you approach women's issues is how you perceive the policy should be towards women. Right? What do you think it's about in your what do you think the activity of women within the Jewish community should be like? And then you start working with how halacha fits into that, right? And then other people say, no, you should take it out from the halacha. It's sort of like a give and take. It's not just you have the detail of the halacha, then come up with something. It's almost like, but I can sort of work with the details of halacha in various different ways. You had this issue in terms of Eretz Yisrael with the Hecht of Shemitah. Okay, there was a policy idea that says, yes, in this situation for the new Yishuv, we have to do a Hecht of Shemitah. Other people said, no, that's not in the spirit of the law. And the people respond, no, it is in the spirit of the law, because the spirit of the law is greater. It also involves Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Then another issue that comes into it, but what about Ne'emana? What about having belief in a Kodesh Baruch Hu and relying upon a Kodesh Baruch Hu? It's not part of the aspect of Shemitah. So specifically, you shouldn't use the Heter Shemitah. These become the issues, and what it really becomes is that policy doesn't just derive from the halacha. Policy sometimes reads into the halacha. Okay, so therefore the question emerges how you make that decision. So in this case, just to show you how further complicated this is, there's another Gemara in Sanhedrin. I'm talking again about the death penalty. There's another Gemara in Sanhedrin, Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, that says, I mentioned it before, that 40 years before the Churban Bayis Sheni, the Sanhedrin moves from Lishkas Hagazit. Lishkas Hagazit is the chamber of hewn stone, right? The chamber of cut stone. And the fact is that was the place of the Sanhedrin on the Har Bayis. Sanhedrin had to be in a place in the Har Bayis like this, and only when the Sanhedrin was sitting in the Lishkas Hagazit could there be capital punishment anywhere, by any Sanhedrin katana. So if there was a capital court up in Haifa, as long as the Sanhedrin was in Lishkas Hagazit, I don't think Haifa was around back then, but if it was a capital court, the fact is that as long as it's sitting in Lishkas Hagazit, the capital court can carry out death penalties. But if the Sanhedrin is not sitting in the Lishkas Hagazit, then capital punishment cannot be carried out by any court. So the Gemara says 40 years they moved away. And Rashi says that the reason for this was, that there was an increase in murderers in the Jewish people, and they didn't have enough to judge them. Therefore they moved from Lishkas Hagazit. So here you have a very interesting idea. You would think if there was an increase in murderers, if you're buying Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's argument that there's an increase in murderers, and the capital punishment challenges the increase in murderers, what's the Sanhedrin doing moving from Lishkas Hagazit to ending capital crime? So Rashi seems to imply because they didn't think they had enough people to judge all these cases correctly. So therefore it seems to imply, well, wait a second, there's a value of justice. So therefore if you don't have enough people being able to judge these cases correctly, then it's best not to judge them at all. That's another policy decision. That seems to imply that there's still an aspect of justice that has to be considered into this whole mix. But here's a clear-cut action by the Sanhedrin that says, with this increase in murderers, we still are going to respond by saying that there has to be a sense of justice, and if it's not done in a just way, then we're willing to accept the consequences of not having capital punishment. Now, there's a little bit more complication in this because the Romans were already in Israel at the time, so the Romans were already applying their laws or maintaining certain aspects of law and order in the country and so forth and so forth. They say that Pontius Pilate was one of the he was actually called back to Rome because he was executing too many people even for the Romans. But it seems to be that there still was Roman, there was still, as they say, there was still Roman law, there was Roman peace. So the fact is that in a certain way there still was law and order, but the fact is we still want to have law and order al pi Torah, but somehow the Sanhedrin said, listen, I don't think we can do it this way, therefore they're going to stop the whole procedure to allow capital punishment. I'm just throwing out this case because I'm trying to throw out the aspect of how complicated policy decisions can be. They're not just simple decisions about reading from Halakha says, I'm going to come up with this nice idea. It really has to read into it many different ways, and in many ways people come to incorrect conclusions of what really is the proper policy or not the proper policy. Like a lot of times people assume that the chumrah or the kula or the chumrah is proper policy. Not necessarily so. A lot of people assume that if you find a heter, there's a lot of people say, well, you have a heter, but it's only a heter. Really, you should be more machmer, not use the heter. Other situations where you're given a heter because you should apply the heter, right? That's really what's correct for you. And then the whole issue of when is it applicable, when is it not applicable. So the fact is, it's much more of a dynamic system than most people think. So the question is, where do we start from in terms of this analysis? How do we work on policy? So the point is in a certain way, this is why the Torah wasn't just given as a book of laws. The fact is, the Torah itself is given as has a lot of a lot of stories or a lot of hashkafa. So the fact is one of the realms is to understand that the halacha lives in a realm of hashkafa. The philosophy that you have in Torah does affect the halacha. It doesn't affect the halacha in a direct way, because that would be called darshan time of the crowd. That would be applying reasons to the halacha. But it does affect the halacha in creating the atmosphere of the halacha. Okay, and a lot of times it is the starting point of a lot of dynamics. Okay, so therefore, that's one of the aspects of working in terms of relating between the fact that we have a lot of information that comes from hashkafa. All of nach is hashkafa. So from there, we develop certain ideas that have to have a dynamic relationship with the halacha. The halacha itself also creates its own statement from policy, and one of the things about this is the fact that the halacha itself sometimes gives contradictory messages. It presents a lot of different contradictory messages, and how you reconcile those contradictory messages is part of the policy decisions. So, for example, you'll have halacha A and halacha B, and they need to be reconciled. So, what happens in a lot of reconciled situations is one, if you have, let's say, halacha A and halacha B, what happens is halacha A, which one is given the priority or the prominence, halacha A, halacha B, and that may come from a hashkafa statement or an idea that says I'm going to read into this, and therefore this is how I'm going to reconcile it. But then the policy is going to be shifted by the reconciliations themselves. This leads into a lot of aspects of machlokesim and halacha. There's differences in different opinions in halacha, and when you look at different opinions in halacha, you have to say, okay, why does one person favor one opinion when another person favors another opinion? Obviously, the two possibilities are both logical. They're both logically consistent. But why is one person take one and another person takes another? And that a lot of times has to do with the policy. Okay, and how it affects which one you're going to give prominence to, or which position you're going to favor in terms of your own perception of Torah. So the fact is that it really is very much of a dynamic system. Any questions so far? Or? Okay. So this gets interesting. In fact, that what it leads to is that a lot of people basically try and defend their policy positions as if it's the only position in Torah, and then they quote sources, and then when they quote sources to back it up, you have to recognize that there's other sources that these sources have to be dealt with by other people. And the question is, where do you get this policy to begin with? Okay, because the fact is that anywhere in Torah, it's always a matter of reconciliations. I always find that like a person will say, here's a Meferish Gemara that supports me. Good. I can tell you that the people who disagree with you have another way of reading that Gemara. There's so much flexibility in the system that the question emerges, well, how do you know your policy directive is really the correct directive? Mainly it's just may just be your reading into the Torah because that's what you like. Let's say you're a nationalistic Jew, and therefore you want to take a pro-Israel understanding of all these various sources. Okay, you're going to pick and choose the ones that you like that go in line with all these sources. Okay, is that a correct way of working through policy? And what I'm getting to now is the fact that policy does have an aspect of your own individuality and subjectivity in it. Because learning itself involves the individual, because the individual ultimately has to apply his shikol hadas, his sort of sense of what's correct, right, between variant opinions. So the point is that it becomes a really complex issue of how it's done and how it should be done. because I think this issue is that since there's so much flexibility, it can lead to basically people saying, okay, I'm going to go with what I like, or I'm going to go with what I think is right, and they don't allow the Torah to challenge themselves either. So, what I think we have to do is outline what are the questions that should be asked in terms of policy directions. How do we go about connecting the dots? What are the questions we're supposed to be asking in terms of looking at the big picture? So let me throw out what I think is a opening question. You look at a halacha. I think the opening question is you start with halacha. And what occurs is that you have a response to that halacha. You don't like that halacha. And you have to look at why is it you don't like that halacha. Say there's a halacha that says, I'll give you a good example. There's halachas, there's limitations on who a kohen can marry, right? So you have a situation of a woman who it seems is usher to a kohen, right? So therefore you have a question, and the kohen asks, "Can I marry this woman?" And you say, "No, it seems that clear cut you cannot marry this woman. So this woman is usher to a kohen." That seems to be a pretty straightforward conclusion. But this is where the whole variety of flexibility comes in. We know that the halacha doesn't just work on what is just the prima facie perception. Okay? Is this woman really usher to a kohen? Is what you perceive to be the isser, the reason for isser, does it really create an isser, a reason to be usher? And that's where you get into actual details of halacha. And you can work out many situations, for example, that it may not be. There may be a limitation on the power of this statement to be an action of prohibition. Let me give you an example. A woman states that she had relations with someone, that because she had relations with this person, she is now usher to a kohen. Right? So you think it's pretty straightforward. She comes forward, she says, okay, there's a kohen, you know something? I had relations with such and such a person, okay, I can no longer marry a kohen. Right? Okay? Now, that should be where it ends, right? You think that's pretty straightforward. What's the problem with that? Why would you say it's maybe not so straightforward?
Whether the male was a Jew.
Well, that's whatever the reason is. That you can sit there and say, well, maybe what you think is prohibited is not really prohibited, and maybe we check it out. You're talking, that one of the prohibitions is a woman's had relations with a non-Jew. Maybe he's a Jew. Let's just check it out. But there's even more fundamental legal issues over there. Actually, in the legal theory, there's a problem.
Was she married to him?
Oh, that becomes another issue. But see, the fact is that one of the problems is because a woman says I had relations with a non-Jew, she's not a kosher aid. Who says you have to listen to her? Who says
She doesn't count.
Who says you have to believe her?
But she was there.
She was there. Only her and the non-Jew were there. So what proof do you have that it's correct? Okay, that becomes an aspect of the technicality of the issue. Now, most people would say, yeah, but let's face it. Yeah, we know it's usher, right? Witnessing is she admits it, right? But now comes another issue. What happens if she was a balish tshuva and so forth, didn't know anything about the law, and now she's really deeply in love with this kohen, right? So they would say, gee, maybe I should try investigating whether this should happen or not. Well, what would be the issue? You're going to investigate it. You're going to try and say, am I going to look for a heter or not look for a heter? Right? The facts are pretty straightforward, but you're going to look for a heter or not look for a heter. So what would be the issue involved over there? So the policy comes into it. What do you think about marriage? If the fact that they're in love and you believe that marriages have a strong romantic element to it, so the fact that they have a relationship is something that should be given tremendous value. So do you look for a heter? Or do you basically have an attitude that's much more um, let's say, pragmatic, okay, and sort of say, you know, there's always someone else. You know, there's another bus coming. So go get another woman, you get another man, it doesn't matter, right? So do you think in terms of romance? Do you not think in terms of romance? And if the reason it becomes somewhat of an issue is because the system itself has a flexibility within it. So you see that's where it comes down to. So now how did you develop this attitude towards romance? So that might have something to do with how you understand the psukim between Adam and Chava, and then let's say give an example. So let's say you look at the romantic relationship between Yaakov and Rachel, right? And you say this is the ideal of Yaakov and Rachel, but is Yaakov and Rachel really the ideal? There's a whole view in Hashkafa that seems to imply that really Leah and Yaakov are the true. Is really the ideal couple, and the proof of that is Leah is actually buried with Yaakov, but then Rachel is always referred to as a Keres Habayis. It seems to be that she was the dominant wife of Yaakov, and it's clear cut that Yaakov had strong emotions for Rachel. But do you give value to those emotions or not? Leah is the one who had more kids. Right? So it might, and how you understand that idea might affect back into his halacha, and then this halacha on the surface saying to you that there's certain people you can marry, certain people you cannot marry, break up relationships, it might go the other way and say this is proof my way. So you see, there's this constant dynamic going on, okay, and policy is a big role in this, because even though you don't use it specifically to analyze the halacha, you use it to put the context of halacha and a lot of motivation of how you're going to work towards, or what you're going to work towards in the halacha. Now, it's really the halacha is supposed to have its own objective system, but the fact is that whether you're motivated, how motivated you are to investigate. Right? There's a statement by Rabbi Soloveitchik, for example, that he stayed up all night one day trying to be mater a woman to a kohen, because he valued the relationship. So he worked hard at it, and felt defeated when he couldn't find the heter. But clearly, if he would have found the heter, he said, go with it. Other people say, if you got the heter, still don't go with it. So that's basically what we're going to work on in terms of trying to understand the policy. Okay? This is a sort of an introduction to the events and the difficulties of the challenge. Okay?